This is Computing Up, conversations about computation writ large with Michael Littman and Dave Ackley. This episode was recorded May 17th, 2021.
Hey Dave, how are things going with you?
All right, how are you doing?
I've had better days, but I think I'm doing better now. I got the second vaccine dose yesterday, and that's kind of knocked me out.
But you think it just shows it's working.
Exactly, that's right. Yeah, it would have been a shame to get a shot and not to actually feel terrible. So yay. But apart from that, it's a lovely day out. It's springtime, and we have a wonderful guest today.
Right.
So today's guest is Michael Lesk, who, if I'm not mistaken, was our boss's boss when we first started working together.
I think so.
And and that was back at Belcor many years ago. And since then, Mike has had a number of other kinds of jobs, including at NSF, the National Science Foundation, and Rutgers. And so we were actually, we worked together at Rutgers for a little bit before I left for Brown. And Mike, thanks so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking me.
You were always one of the most fascinating people to talk to back in the day, and I'm sure that remains true now, because you always had an interesting story. Like, I remember you holding forth on railroad signaling as a topic, which it's hard to imagine that being interesting, but you made it so very interesting. So why is that? Why is railroad interesting?
So where that story comes from is that somebody at Bell, this is before I met you, this was at Bell Labs, someone announced they were going to have a short 1 or 2 day meeting on the uses of statistics for decision making. And I looked at that and I said, this is going to be yet another argument between the people who believe in multiple regression and the people who believe in multidimensional scaling, since we had rather determined members of both religious sects in the area.
I feel like these aren't even religious sects anymore. Like, what are the two sects? So multidimensional scaling is like dimension reduction, right? And what's the other one?
Multiple regression.
What is that?
Which is also dimensionality reduction.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. So this is one of those, like, the Northern Baptists and the Southern Baptists can't get along.
Or it's
the
like
Northeastern Baptists and the...
Or the people who use SPSS versus the people who use SAS. Okay?
Right. These are statistics packages. Okay, all right.
Yeah. So I said, this is ridiculous. They only want a 1-page submission. You know, I can do that in an hour or so. So I wrote and said, it's not about data analysis. It's about luck. And the examples were that now, I'm now going to tell you something that was true in 1980. And I will, at the end of this, tell you what's changed. But in 1980, if you stood by the side of a railroad track in the U.S. and there was a signal near you, it was almost certainly green. It was only red if a train had just passed. If you did that in the UK, the signal was red. It was only green if a train was about to pass the signal. Our signals were default red. Theirs were default green. It's the same amount of work to run either protocol. And it turns out that this was the result of an accident. The British used to do it in the early days with default green. Then in 1876, there was an ice storm somewhere in England where there are not usually ice storms. And the signals in those days were semaphore arms. So they froze in the default position. And 3 signalmen in a row watched this train go rolling past. They knew they had to stop it, but none of their signals worked. And 3 people died. And when they picked through the wreckage, they said, we see how never to have this accident again. So they went to default red. The difference now is that if you stand by the side of an American track, the signal is turned out to save the bulb life. So it's simply out. The second one is The brakes on trains are automatic. If the train breaks apart, each half of the train is supposed to stop. And this is done because you can think of it as there's a spring with each brake trying to push the brake on. There's a pipe running the length of the train with a difference in air pressure. And that difference in air pressure keeps the spring from applying the brake. If the train breaks apart and the pipe is vented to the atmosphere, the spring works and stops. Now, in reality, in both countries, the spring is actually an air tank at a pressure differential. Now, in the U.S., the pipe running the length of the train is at high pressure, about 100 psi. In the UK at the time, it was vacuum. And again, why is it vacuum in one country and high pressure in the other? Well,
my guess is you have to drive on the correct side of the street.
Exactly.
Not quite. One day in the 1860s or early 70s, the George Westinghouse, who invented the air brake, had a demonstration train, and he was driving the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Railroad on his demo train. They came up to a crossing, and there was some teamster, in the old meaning of a guy with a wagon and some horses, stuck on the crossing. And Westinghouse brought the train to a stop. Everybody, all the railroad officials got off, looked at the situation, said, we could never have stopped that train in time if we had had to whistle for brakemen to set the brakes. And the Pennsylvania bought Westinghouse's brake. The Pennsylvania called itself the standard railroad of the world. It was just about the biggest and most important U.S. railroad, so everybody copied them. Again, that accident didn't happen in the U.K., and they had invented the vacuum brake, so they stuck with theirs. Again, time has passed. There's a problem with the vacuum brake. You can't possibly have more than a 15-pound pressure differential. So you need bigger equipment to operate it, and the air brake is thus actually better, and the British have changed. But that was the story about signaling.
Right, and so how do you keep this fresh in your mind? Do you tell this story often, or these details are just seared into your memory?
I even published it in IEEE when I was writing on security and privacy.
And what's the connection to security and privacy?
Reliability.
Aha. This is a good Dave topic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Mike, do you have any thoughts about how things like that can be designed to be more fail-safe and be more robust from the get-go? I mean, we're deploying information technology so fast now that there's no time to wait 10 years and have an accident and then fix it.
Well, as people should have known at Colonial Pipeline, you're supposed to do rehearsals. You're not just supposed to say, oh, we have backups, so someday we can restore them. You're supposed to actually run an exercise where you try to restore from the backup.
But that costs money. That takes time.
Well, the other thing is that it really takes attention. And one of the problems is that in most systems that I know about, they don't actually worry first level about reliability. About 10 years ago, I was on a National Academy panel about patient safety and electronic health records. And other people on the panel, one of whom, by the way, you will know because Ashish Jha is on CNN sort of every other day talking about coronavirus, and he's also dean of a school at Brown. But he's on the
public
panel.
health dean. Yeah.
And he's really good, by the way.
Okay.
At one point, it's a separate story, but anyway, I learned two interesting system type level things. One was, they said, the first software in most hospitals did patient billing. Patient billing is not time critical and it is not safety critical. So it could be done badly. But then they started patching in.
And that's the
we can
goal,
patch
right?
this software to have the pharmacy records. We can patch this software to do operating room scheduling. We can patch this, and that is not a good way to develop reliable software, to start with crap and start patching it.
Yeah, that's
The
kind of the
second,
bottom-up network theory of just, rather than trying to have an overarching, what do we have to care about first, and then implement it down. But that's the way systems grow, right? I mean, so we have to imagine that's going to happen.
I know I can only say, well, I have this project where I realized that my software, even at only 500 lines of code, had gotten out of hand in the sense that it wasn't well organized, and I sat down and rewrote it. Once in a while, you have to do that. On the other hand, the last time I looked, which was only 2 years ago, one of the major medical record systems still has its back end written in COBOL, which tells you how.
And nobody can touch it.
The other, though, they advertise if you search for employment ads for COBOL programming, you will probably find them.
Right.
But the other thing I learned is, okay, when this panel, most of the members were doctors. And when we introduced ourselves, all these doctors were quick to point out that although they were now a hospital director or whatever, they still treated patients. It was very important to them. And they said the best people in a hospital want to be involved in patient care. So managing the IT system is done by people who are not the best and who would like an easy day when all they do is play golf with the salesman for the medical records vendor. And that's, they said, another reason why a lot of this stuff is very, very bad. It's incredibly expensive, by the way. You'll find that the contracts for an EHR system for a hospital chain are hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't believe it. There was an effort, the VA had an open source system. And at one point, the then Senator Jay Rockefeller tried to get it adopted nationwide and basically got shouted down. First of all, there were too many people making money in the business.
Right.
And secondly, the VA doesn't have to do billing. And it turned out that meant there was an awful lot of stuff that wasn't in the VA system. The VA has given it up, by the way, and gone to using commercial code.
Well, I mean, this all sounds very depressing. It all sounds like information technology is going to suck. It's going to get insufficient attention, and yet it's going to be an incredible cost center. Are we screwed? I mean, is there any hope?
Well, there are companies that actually care about it. Every so often in the library world, somebody asks me, and I say, you should do your data and computing in the cloud because Amazon and IBM and Google can afford much better security staff than you will ever even be able to think about hiring, let alone that you're not willing to spend money on it. So don't do it yourself. I got that one. Do you know the name David Rosenthal?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm sure I went to summer camp with someone by that name.
Yeah, he was at Stanford for many. He wasn't at Stanford. His wife, Vicky Reich, is at Stanford. He was NVIDIA. He was at one startup, which did very well. But he once said to me, he writes a very nice blog, DSHR blog. He said, if you have fewer than 500 processors, you are wasting money if you are doing your own systems administration.
I mean, so that's the put all your eggs in one basket and watch the basket really closely model.
Right. And actually spend effort on it. I have a friend named Mark Seiden whose job for a long time was security penetration for banks. And, he had stories. It's appalling the things that worked.
Right.
The one that's sort of simplest and easiest, he realized that the way they did their backups was that at 3:00 every Friday afternoon, somebody drove up to the back door of the comm center, knocked on it, said, "I'm here from Iron Mountain." They gave him a box of tapes and he drove away. So Mark bought an Iron Mountain shirt on eBay, arrived at 2:45 on a Friday, and they gave him the box of tapes.
Right.
Social engineering.
And, so there's, you, in some sense, you get what you paid for if you don't spend any effort, because, again, like the hospitals, you think that computing is how you make PowerPoint slides. Well, if I couldn't make PowerPoint for a couple of days, nobody would die or go broke or anything. But
I mean,
now,
part of it seems to me, is that building new information technology increases the leverage. A reel of 8-track mag tape can hold as much stuff as giant boxes of paper. And if it was really all on paper, one guy in an Iron Mountain t-shirt couldn't steal that much. But we deliberately concentrate it to make the damage greater.
Fewer points of failure. So when they fail completely.
They fail bigger.
Well,
yeah.
But that's a very interesting strategic question. Are we better off if everybody in the world uses Microsoft Word, and if it turns out that there's a security flaw in Word, then everybody gets hit? Or are we better off if there are 10 different word processors, so some people will survive?
Right.
We've decided that monopoly is better, but it ought to come with more care than we now take about it.
Which means it ought to come with more liability than we now assign it.
Yeah.
Yes. Higher.
Well, so this is very depressing, as Dave said, but maybe we can get. Let me ask a question a different way. So Mike, you were like on the ground floor in the group that was developing Unix, I think, back in the day, right? So you've watched information technology really from the beginning to now. Have we made any progress at all?
I was programming in 1961. I mean, I tell people quite truthfully, I was working in digital libraries in 1961. We didn't call it that, but that's when I started.
Which is a great date because it's the same upside down. So, but that was, I think what you're saying is that was a long time ago. Yes.
Yes.
Well, it was long before Unix.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Oh, I see.
I learned to program on the UNIVAC 1. I remember thinking, I am 16 years old. With reasonable luck, someday I will be the only person left in the world who has programmed the UNIVAC 1.
Probably have achieved this.
Right, but wait. So, but the question is, do you see, if you take a step back and you look at the trends from then to now, like what are we doing better now? What are we doing worse now? Or are we just basically stuck repeating the same mistakes over and over again?
We actually have much better software development practices. One of the other stories I told people regularly was the first time I had to write a suffixing algorithm, I was writing an IBM 7094 assembler, and it took me working quarter time about a week. The next time I had to do it, it was in C, and it took me, 2 or 3 hours. And the next time I had to do it, it was in Perl, and it was 5 minutes. And
a suffixing algorithm, this means like taking like an English word and popping the suffix off.
Precisely.
So you're left with like the root or whatever, the lemma.
Yes.
And this is a thing that you've been doing from way back when, right? So Wikipedia talks about your contribution to Lex and also your contribution to the Lesk algorithm.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the Lesk algorithm, I think, is that the suffixing work?
No, that's sense disambiguation. I never did suffixing beyond the trivial. It didn't do, there was somebody in 1968 named Julie Lovins who did a very nice job on suffixing with a 20-page report listing all sorts of special cases. Um, and as far as I can see, it died without notice. It did not get picked up by NLTK or anything important, and everybody is using a less effective suffixing algorithm. But it turns out people don't seem to care that much about suffixing. I don't, I don't know why it ought to matter because it improves. I tell people sense disambiguation doesn't get used much because what it does is improve precision at the cost of recall, and most people want more recall and less precision. But suffixing is the other way around. It improves recall at a cost in precision, and you'd think most people would want that. So all I can say is people want simplicity. But you were asking a better question, which is, do we have better strategy for how we do software development? And I would say at some level, not much. There are some places where people do it better, but for example, Multics thought a lot more about security than Unix. And people dumped Multics and didn't go around insisting, oh, we have to put that stuff into Unix. And
well, I mean, ACLs and so on eventually sort of backed their way into Unix down the road, but it was begrudgingly as needed rather than the grand vision up front.
There's still a large ingredient in software development of first we'll write the demo, and then we'll hypothesize that we're going to rewrite it better later, except we don't. Sometimes we do. I mean, in the original days of Unix, every time the computer crashed, and that was fairly often, the file system was screwed up. It was like 5 years before Bill Joy sat down and said, I am going to sequence all the file system operators so that when you are doing something and the system stops in the middle, you have a system which is in a consistent state. So you don't have to run FSCK every time the system starts up to clean up the crap from misplaced pointers and the like.
So that's better. That's more robust.
So that is something was done better, but it was done by somebody else who went back to fix it up, and that's not done enough because all of the credit goes to the people who did it first, not the people who did it right. Not that I'm not crying for Bill Joy. He did very well in life. He's done very well in life. But
so Mike, if you were doing, digital libraries or sort of precursors for digital libraries in the early 60s, I mean, how do you get from chemical physics to information retrieval? I mean, to look at your CV.
So I arrive in college. They say, what do you want to major in? I say math, knowing almost nothing about science other than basic high school classes. They say, the math department doesn't want to be bothered with first-year students. And the curious thing was I came in officially as a freshman, became a sophomore after a month, but that hadn't happened yet. So by their standards, I was a freshman. So they said, okay, the math department doesn't want to be bothered with you. Your advisor will be someone in applied math. It was Jerry Salton, who is famous in the IR community. In those days, in 1961, you couldn't hire programmers. So Jerry just offered a job to any student he came in contact with. Some of us stuck, some of us didn't. I was the one who stuck, one of the ones who stuck.
Okay.
And so for the next 3 years, I worked for Salton part-time while I was getting my undergraduate degree in chemistry, which I discovered I liked. I had had several years of bad math courses, several years of good chem courses. Again, this is somewhat my fault. I had placed out of the introductory math classes. So I was taking the second and third year classes of the very traditional math sequence, very old fashioned. The person who taught me math the second year I was in college had been born in the 19th century. Okay.
Wow.
So I was getting this and it was, so I said, all right, chemistry looks like so much more fun. So I switched into chemistry. Went to graduate school. At that time, you could not go to graduate school in computer science.
Right.
And applied math was, Green's functions and other stuff that I didn't really care about. And then I keep working for Jerry, even though Jerry does not get tenure at Harvard and goes to Cornell, which slight he remembers for the rest of his life. But anyway, well, he died in 95, so not that long. Anyway,
He's not bothered by it now.
Eventually, I come to the end of my school, and I have a PhD in chemistry and 8 years of experience with Salton. And I go looking for jobs, and I discover that, well, the boom of the 60s in research is starting to crater. And if I want to become a chemist, I can go to UCSD or Iowa State. If I want to become a computer scientist, I have interview requests from Berkeley, Chicago, Bell Labs, and Arthur D. Little, and I decide I'll become a computer scientist. So I go to Bell Labs, and that's what happened.
Well, and so then time passes, and you and Michael and I meet at Belcor, and you are our boss's boss at that point. And I remember that I always loved having you up there because you supported people in whatever crazy stuff they were thinking. I mean, so is research management, managing researchers, is that different than any other management, or what was your take on it?
Well, it is somewhat different. There's an old saying, the support of research is the support of failure. But there's also something else. In my experience, there are managers who are loved by their superiors and hated by their subordinates, and managers who are loved by their subordinates and hated by their superiors. And I tried to be the second kind, the ones that their subordinates liked and their superiors didn't.
It worked for me.
Right. And I think, Dave, I remember you saying it as basically that he would engage with the higher ups and deal with, like fight with them so that we were protected from that. Right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, my phrase was, Mike had his back to us.
Yeah, that was it.
Because he was facing further up and keeping them away, and then would come nerd out about whatever some random conversation like that, and that was great.
I mean, one thing that really struck me, right? So this was my first job out of college, so I didn't know what people were generally like, but Mike was not right again, not just our boss, so Tom Landauer was the boss of our group, but then Mike was the head of his group and a bunch of other groups, and I would think, okay, when you're that high up in management, like your job is to just deal with people and stuff. But whenever there was an actual coding problem, right, that was when Mike would step up and say, oh yeah, you have to get these. So we had a project where we were doing information retrieval. An interface called Superbook, where you could actually browse around and find useful information and read. And getting figures into Superbook was really hard because at the time, image processing was really, it was bad. Yeah. There wasn't a lot of compute to push all those bits around. And so dealing with the file formats was a huge pain in the butt. And I was hired essentially to deal with the low-level stuff so that the other people in the group could think about higher level stuff, but the only one who could get the images to work was Mike because it was just too crazy.
The person who really could do that stuff was Steve Euler.
Oh yeah.
One of my problems when I was at Bell Labs and Belcor, there was always somebody better than I that I could go to for help, whether it was Ken and Dennis or whether it was Euler and Redmond. But then I got to NSF, and we hired somebody from the University of Illinois, and then I got to Rutgers, and now nobody else could program at all to first approximation.
And part of that is you're in a library school, or what used to be a library school, right? So you're not in the CS department.
Correct.
Hopefully there's a couple good programmers in the CS department.
There are. There the where was I?
Good programmers.
No. I'm backing up. The Superbook stuff. That was in some ways very sad because it was actually a good thing, and we never marketed it. I mean, there were sort of book reading programs that eventually got out there, but none of them was us. And part of it was that you really have to be there at the right time.
Yeah.
I think Superbook was too early. The other thing in the same category in book reading, any of you ever hear of the Franklin Reader? Franklin was a company that sold ebooks around the year 2000.
Yeah.
And it was a total market failure. And then 8 years later, Amazon produces the Kindle. And I have tried saying to people, what's the difference? Why did Franklin fail and Amazon succeeded? The most obvious answer to me is there weren't actually many books available on the Franklin Reader. They had collected all of the out of copyright books, right, which many people are not interested in. The device was a little heavier. The screen was a little less clear. And of course, they didn't have the marketing power of Amazon. But I can't really tell you which it is. The real person who got stuck being in the wrong time was Scott Stornetta. Scott is one of the inventors of blockchain. And a few years later, he was teaching high school math. He has now been hired by some Chinese investment company. So,
well, I don't know. It seems like this is a real problem with research labs and technology transfer and all that stuff, which of course, the government and DARPA and NSF, these people are always talking about technology transfer, but it all seems like it's magic. And like you say, it's the right moment, the right combination of things, not the best technology. You're lucky if the best technology even comes in second or whatever. And so that when people start to come around and say, well, what has this research lab really done for us? It's hard to come up with the wins.
I completely agree with you. I mean, you will both remember, of course, Jim Holland and the movie browser and collaborative filtering. Now, you may know this story better than I do, but my perception of what happened is this was invented. Nobody at Belcore had any interest in it. A PhD student from MIT, from the Media Lab, visited, brought the idea back to MIT. They created a startup called Firefly, which I believe they eventually sold to Microsoft. And it had a really good marketing campaign.
Right.
There was something called word of mouse, and they succeeded. And so nowadays you go to Amazon and everything you see is based on other people who bought this book also read, half of what you see is that. The other half is the publisher is paying us to show you this one.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a perfect mix there to maintain a shred of credibility while packing in the stuff that people are paying for.
Well, Amazon, do they actually carefully identify the things that are paid for? Google does, although the distinction is getting weaker and weaker.
Yeah.
Baidu doesn't. There's no distinction between this one is paid for and this one is, actually selected by the algorithm.
I mean, certainly the Amazon pages still have sponsored stuff, the word sponsored appearing in a bunch of places, but who knows exactly how that's blending together.
Yeah. I mean, one of the oddball questions one of my friends is Brewster Kahle, who runs the Internet Archive.
Oh,
And how do you back up? How do you capture the Amazon pages? Because the Amazon page is different every time you approach, and
right.
for every person who approaches. So what do you save if you want to save today's Amazon front page? Amazon actually has an entire parallel network of traditional hyperlinks through its pages, precisely to help Google and Bing and the Internet Archive capture everything that they want to. But
Or everything that
how often?
Amazon wants them to capture.
Well, that's exactly right. Amazon wants.
Right.
But interesting. So I wanted to ask you also a little bit. Dave brought up the idea of research management, but you had a stint at the National Science Foundation.
Yes.
What did you learn from that experience in terms of managing a huge research portfolio? Like, did you have that same kind of how did you say it before, that you wanted the people below you to be happy and the people above you to not be happy? Did you use that idea at the NSF as well?
Well, at NSF, it's actually your job to try to improve the general research community rather than your particular chunk of it, since almost nobody has any influence on the overall structure is in an active Congress, and it's really nailed down and difficult to muck with. So what you can do is to say, well, I'd like to have a new program in this or that area, or conceivably, I'd like to abolish the program in this or that area, although I can tell you that there's an old word that's much harder to take $1 away from somebody who has it than to offer $1 to somebody that doesn't have it. You get a much louder squeal and intervention. So at one point I got tired of AI at NSF, meaning case-based reasoning, and I did away with that program. And it was,
wow.
I understand that Judea Pearl would have been justified to be really angry, but not enough other people. I got a nasty letter, but because nasty letters can be ignored, nothing much happened. The other thing is you try to learn from the people around you. I mean, there was a guy, Howard Moraff, who had been at NSF for like 20 years. He was very sharp, very smart. He ran the robotics program, and I tried to rely on his advice about how to do things, even though I'm not a roboticist. The real problem is there's perhaps too much personality in this. In some ideal world, research funding, I think, would be basically more stable. NSF, of course, is nowhere near where DARPA is, but it's not as stable as NIH. Right. And there's something you can said for the NIH strategies.
Well, how would you characterize the differences between them? Because I think for people outside of that inner circle, I imagine it's very difficult to make any distinctions at all.
Some people don't. I still remember the day when somebody sent it. Almost all proposals at NSF arrive within 24 hours of the deadline. So, people are editing them frantically. And I do remember the proposal where someone had forgotten to go in and change every mention of ARPA to NSF. Okay, so DARPA deliberately does not want to keep doing the same thing. All of their projects are time limited. They are not interested in long-term support of anything.
Right.
And they make a point of saying, what's new about this? And they do a lot of really interesting stuff. They also did stuff on a large scale. One of the sad things going on is that after 9/11, DARPA got much more focused on military stuff and did much less general computing, although, they're the reason you have self-driving cars.
To the degree that we do.
To the degree that you do, yes.
Yeah.
Now, NIH, the program staff has very little discretion. NSF, the reviewers for every proposal are ad hoc. If your proposal is turned down with a comment, there should be, more about there should be more about random forests and less about SVM. There's no point in you worrying about that, since the next reviewers will not be the same people and they won't know what revisions you made. At NIH, the next reviewers will be the same people. Mm-hmm. And if they say, we would fund this if you would use SVM instead of random forest, you can expect that to happen. NIH is also willing to support long-term stuff. Now, for somebody like me who cares a great deal about piling up data, it's important that there be people willing to fund institutions like PubMed and NLM and the GenBank on a long-term basis. DARPA absolutely will not. NSF is split. It does share some. The Protein Data Bank, for example, is shared between NSF and NIH, and it's gone for decades. Ditto a number of other, the Geo Directorate at NSF funds a lot of perpetual databases. The Computing Directorate does a little bit of, quote, infrastructure, most of which is large-scale computing hardware, some of which is data, but not much. And that's one thing I did not succeed. I tried to persuade people at NSF we should expand the definition of infrastructure to include data content. And it didn't work. The first problem was there were too many people who said, no, this is about research. We can't just support data. There was a large ingredient of, well, if this is so good, why doesn't industry fund it? And then there was a very practical problem. At one point, Rouge and Abadji got a task force together to do a revision of infrastructure. And it involved both reviewing the supercomputer centers and trying to think about anything new. And she appointed people from both areas. And fundamentally, the people from the supercomputer world did their politics right. They wrote their documents, they made their arguments, they drummed up support. The people in the data area did not. Somebody let it slide, aside from the fact that the data people agree with each other much less. And so, in the end, it didn't happen. That's another comment I make. Once upon a time, there were 5 supercomputer centers. They got to be reduced to 2 as sort of everybody realized that the traditional supercomputers were out, that nobody was going to be buying the Cray 98 or whatever it was going to be. And in the process of reducing from 5 to 2 supercomputers, those people learned politics. So the University of Illinois, NCSA, had an office in Washington, down the block from NSF. CMU didn't do that. Stanford didn't do that, but the supercomputer people did.
Yeah, I don't know. It certainly makes me think of that. I feel like computer science people overthink the idea that the ideas matter. as opposed to the politics and the social engineering of the thing. And, so that computer science people, when they're on NSF panels, for example, will trash each other, like that, when engineering people who are also on NSF panels will pump each other up, because it's sort of the bigger picture. Whereas the computer science, maybe this is because it's a young field or it's just full of ornery people. I don't know what, but it feels like we shoot ourselves in the foot a lot by saying, no, it's SVM versus random trees or whatever.
Random forests.
Sorry. I
could
make
a
random tree algorithm. Just you watch.
Well, the people who really do it well are the astronomers. The astronomers have a meeting every 10 years, I believe, at which they get together and say, okay, in the next decade, we're going to build 3 new telescopes. The first one, and they argue this out, the first one will be located in Hawaii and run by the University of California. The next one will be located in New Mexico and run by the University of Texas. The one after that will be in Chile and run by the Ohio State. And then they go to NSF and everybody agrees.
Right.
There is nobody saying, actually, I think that telescope should go here. Whereas even in 1969, I remember somebody suggested that we should get all the basic works of English and American literature into machine readable form. And somebody put together a plan in which IBM Poughkeepsie would handle the computing because they knew about it and they had the resources, and Vassar would be the English Lit department. And remember, this is 69. There's no networking. You actually need
to be close.
And NSF was going to provide the money, and this was going great guns. And somebody from Berkeley showed up and said, "Why is Vassar getting that? We want it." And NSF said, "Plague on both your houses. Come back when you figure this out," which was 30 years.
No.
Well, I don't know. Maybe we're doing it better now than we used to. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not convinced. I hung around a little bit with some particle physicists, and I do think that they have a similar kind of structure to what you're describing in terms of.
I guess
having,
if you want to do a 5-mile accelerator or something, you
need to all be on the same page with that.
Yeah. Well, so while you were at NSF, Mike, you killed off case-based reasoning as a basis of AI. You sent us a graph before this recording today about, I guess, the uses of AI kind of going through a winter and so forth. What's your take on AI these days?
I'm really sitting trying to decide how much of this is hype. And
Michael's stuff is all hype.
Well, I'll give you a specific example of the problem. I had a student who worked at the San Diego Zoo. They had lots of camera traps, which are cameras with motion sensor shutters that take a picture of anything moving in front of them. And they had 100 of these in Kenya trying to count giraffes, so they could decide whether the giraffe population was stable or endangered. And so at one point, the student gives me 2.5 million JPEGs. And the question is, how many of these contain a giraffe? And the trouble was there are AI people who were saying, we can do that, 95% accuracy. And the biologists, the zoologists would get the code and say, this only works 20% of the time. And the student, who was really good, organized a meeting. She talked Google and Microsoft into paying for it. And she got together the two sides and said, okay, let's understand this. And the answer is, you need 2,000 tagged pictures, and you'd really like the animals to walk up to the camera and fill the frame. And so at least we now sort of understand what you can reasonably hope to achieve in this world. Me being me, I was trying to cheat. I said, here's a color region in hue saturation value space that seems very peculiar to giraffe spot. Let's just look for this. And that turns out not to work if only the head of the giraffe is sticking up above the trees. But okay.
But what do you get percentage-wise? I mean, it's nothing's going to give you 100%.
The answer is they can do well. The other thing that happened at this meeting that was really important was that somebody was carrying on about the ability to identify individual giraffes by the spot pattern. And this has been done for zebras, by the way, the zebra barcodes.
And they don't even have spots, so that's pretty interesting.
They have barcodes, so they have better than spots. But Tanya Berger, University of Illinois.
Yeah.
So somebody's complaining that the giraffe recognition program only works if the right side of the giraffe is facing the camera. And after moaning about this for a while, somebody else pops up and says, I'm a statistician. You're telling me it's exactly a 50% chance whether you can recognize the giraffe? I can do that math for you. And so that's the other thing. If all you care about is changes in the giraffe population, it doesn't matter whether you're 90% or 50% effective as long as it's consistent.
Right, as long as it's uncorrelated with the change in the population. If all the left-going giraffes are dying.
So I know we run out of time. So what I'm leaving you with is a message about time and chance happeneth to all things. And that's often true. Oh, actually, you asked about AI. And so my question is, there have been some amazing results. If you had asked me in 1961, which is easier, summarization or translation, I would have said, summarization is much easier.
Right.
Well, we have translation. We don't have summarization. And I can remember in 69 or 70, one of the Belcorp managers saying, which are we going to have first? Which is easier, machine translation or chess? And I said, chess is easier. That one I got right. We did get the world chess champion before we got translation. But I'm really surprised at how hard summarization is proved out to be. So what I think I've learned is, and this is an old story in AI, there are problems that people think are hard. And when an AI researcher solves it, everyone says, oh, that's not AI.
It's not hard anymore.
I mean, the late Jaime Carbonell once explained statistical language translation to me in 30 seconds. And the difference was that now we had enough in the way of compute power and data to actually do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. So summarization ends up implying deeper understanding of a text, which suggests that the machine translation that we're doing is really not understanding it very deeply. And in fact, you don't need to, because the statistical patterns are strong enough to carry it over enough to be more or less understandable. That's very interesting. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of a diss about machine translation. But on the other hand, it seems like a good test for saying how far have we gotten? How far can you summarize this? The sort of explain like I'm 5 approach or something.
It's not explain like I'm 5. It's just, it turns out you can't make a good summary by picking sentences out of the text. I mean, I've actually tried it. I took Sherlock Holmes stories and said, can I circle 10 sentences in this story that would be acceptable as a summary? And the answer is no, you can't do that.
Right. So there is this internalization and regeneration required that maybe you can somewhat avoid in the translation case.
But it's interesting because in movies and TV, I think they do that. Like they'll be like, previously on, and then they'll show you just little bits of dialogue from the previous episode that kind of get you back up to speed.
Yeah, but they're done by humans.
Oh, totally. But
Well,
I thought that
here's one that really...
Okay, go ahead. The Sherlock Holmes example that you were giving, was that also from humans, or was that you were trying to make it automatic?
I was doing it. I was saying, "Can I do this?"
Right, but you couldn't.
I couldn't.
Yeah,
don't
but
believe...
the TV people do it. Maybe they're just better at it. Or maybe TV is just a better medium for context-free information.
Well, the Sherlock Holmes stories are not written in the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another whole problem. For a while, I was making fun of machine translation by running the first paragraph of Around the World in 80 Days and through something. And I remember somebody complaining to me and saying, this paragraph that got generated isn't even English. If we didn't all know what the plot was, you wouldn't understand it. But then somebody else showed up and said, all the modern machine translation has been built with modern French. That's 150-year-old French. And that's why it's being botched. I actually went to a native speaker and said, is this really not interpretable in modern French? He said, oh, of course we understand it, but we do recognize it as old-fashioned.
Right. Well, Mike, it's really great to talk to you and just to hear the sort of depth of decades in experience in information technology and how on the one hand stuff changes, but on the other hand it kind of doesn't. And I'm just really thrilled you could come talk to us today.
Thank you. A pleasure.
This was Computing Up. Thanks for listening.